Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes to see if we have some more people joining us. Okay, well, we've got some people coming in. We may have some people joining us as we go along, but I will start the session with a good evening and welcome to this evening's session of artwork. I would like to start the evening with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to these people, past, present, and future, while also recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, their beliefs, and their relationship to the land. We also recognize that Lethbridge is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Suzanne Lindt. I'm the Executive Director of the Allied Arts Council. A little bit about us. The Arts Council is a 64-year-old multidisciplinary umbrella organization, an arts service organization. Our mission is really simple: to build a vibrant arts community in Lethbridge and in the Southern Alberta region. Our activities are huge and varied, very diverse. We manage CASA, which is the City of Lethbridge Community Arts Center, Art Hub. We provide administrative services to the City of Lethbridge Public Art Program. We engage quite a bit with their public art program. We communicate on arts issues. We promote arts events. And we can coordinate a presenting opportunity for both performance and visual artists in a hope and an attempt to connect them to larger audiences. One of our ongoing programs is artwork. It's been going for a couple of years now. Actually, probably longer. It was a pre-COVID program that we pivoted online during COVID and found great success with this format. So have continued with this as a post-COVID protocol. This series is offered to practicing artists. It's a professional development series, and we try to provide topics of interest to working artists to help them further their careers. We are truly delighted that you've joined us this evening for this particular session, which is how to get started in public art. Before I start, I'd like to introduce my co-worker, Angeline Simon. Angeline is a practicing photographer, a very talented local artist, and she is the person who's going to keep this session running from a technology point of view. So welcome to Angeline. She'll also be handling questions at the end. So we're asking that you put your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box, and we will have our guests address the questions with Angeline being the monitor at the end of the session. Please also introduce yourself. Okay, at this point, I'd like to welcome our two guests this evening. We're really delighted to have Caitlin Darcy Brown and Wayne Garrett with us this evening. These folks are award-winning artists who have actually jumped that magic wall and have created a really vibrant career for themselves as public artists. Caitlin is a graduate of the Alberta University of the Arts, and Wayne trained as a musician at Mount Royal University and also as a machinist at Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. Caitlin and Wayne have an extensive regional, national, and international exhibition history, and they are well recognized and respected for the work that they are doing in the public domain. And they're just some really wonderful, fun people. So we are really happy to have them with us. And we're really looking forward to your presentation this evening. So I'm really happy to have you here, and I'll hand it over to you to share all that you know.
Well, I don't know how much we know, but we'll share everything we got.
Yeah, thanks so much for the intro and for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us, everybody. Thanks to the Allied Arts Council of Lethbridge and all the staff there who are facilitating this talk tonight. I'm Caitlin.
And I'm Wayne.
And I guess our pronouns are she, her.
And he, him.
And we're based in Calgary, Mohkinstsis, here in Treaty 7. We're going to share some of our kind of experience with public art making. It's a vast and diverse world. And so we'll tell you a little bit about our own path and our own route, and also some routes that we've seen other people take into the world of public art, with an eye on the practical. Although, you know, I feel like because of our mixed backgrounds, we're never very far from the conceptual, really.
Mm-hmm. And while we will be looking at kind of some entry points into making public art, it's by no means a complete survey of how to get to that point. There are all sorts of directions through which people go.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to share my screen, and you folks will let me know if for some reason this doesn't work, but I think it should. Artwork. We really like this title, actually. Just so much of art is work, and so yeah, I think that's a really lovely kind of way of like talking about the work of art and the work of art making. Ooh, is it gonna work? Hold on. So why public art, I think, is actually a more legitimate question than it might immediately sound like. This is a question that sometimes when people come to sort of discuss their own interests in public art, this is the question we always kind of want to ask them, which is like, are you someone who's interested in public art for scale and wanting to work beyond the size of the body? Are you interested in spaces beyond the institution and maybe institutional critique? Are you interested in working in a space that isn't just for artists, as so many institutions seem to sometimes be, whether or not they intend to be? Are you interested in diverse publics? Like, is that something that you're sort of drawn to? Some people come through the sort of route of the architect and designer realm, which is kind of interesting on some of the more municipally funded scales of public art making. And our theory with that is actually because most folks who seem to go through architecture programs end up with a particular type of training that you often have to learn yourself if you're a public artist. So things like a particular type of material expertise, or working with a certain type of client, or rendering work in a particular way, which we're going to kind of get to. So there's kind of all sorts of routes into public art. But if this is something that you're keen on, I think it is worth asking yourself that question: why public art?
And to be clear, this is a question that we're often re-asking ourselves, you know, as we look at our own careers and think about, you know, where we want to be making work, what kind of work we want to make, and what it is that's exciting about public art.
Let me put this over here just in case you can see it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, this is like a lovely group of folks that we made a public performance piece with at one time. And I just think it's a nice group to remember when asking that question. So not all public art is a monolith. I'm just gonna close that too in case you can see that. Public art, I think it's easy to assume, often comes in one sort of type, which is the monolith, but not all public art is permanent, large scale, object-based, commissioned. Legal, I think, is good to remind folks. Like, there's quite a bit of street art that is public art that is technically illegal, but that doesn't mean it's illegitimate. It's not all needed or wanted, which is also something to sort of be honest with yourself about sometimes when working in public space. It's not all apolitical, stationary. There has been in recent years a desire to move from municipalities to move public art more into the functional realm, but not all public art should be functional. or is functional. Not all public art is created alone. Again, like the name of the artist is sort of like when you think about filmmaking and there's like a name of a director on something, like clearly a film was not made by one person. And it's the same with public work. And the larger the scale of work, usually the more people worked on it. And you sort of sometimes as the artist get the credit and the responsibility of being the one at the helm of the ship. But over recent years, I think we've been trying more actively to make sure that we're crediting all the many, many people who are involved in, especially in our work.
Yeah, and we'll speak a little more towards the end of this presentation about the sort of collaborative nature of public art making and all the various stakeholders and parties that end up being involved, especially with the larger scale projects. But yeah, suffice to say, public art is a really, really broad umbrella, and there's, you know, a huge variety of work that falls under that category beyond just a big public monoliths.
Yeah, so who are we to tell you anything about public art stuffs? Yeah, I mean, we sort of touched on who we are a little bit, and thank you for the introduction. I guess maybe to back it up a little bit, we've been working more in the public realm since about 2012, and those were we began in more like temporary capacities, more festival capacities, which tend to be really good stepping stones into public art making, like works that are temporary in nature, are sometimes self-commissioned, etc. And then our first, we put permanent in quotation marks because that term, we have a love-hate relationship with that term. It's we think of things as long-term temporary, because honestly the built environment, like that's nothing's permanent.
Yeah, so if I may, we'll start by just giving a brief look at some of our practice and how we got into public art making before we touch on some more practical aspects of, you know, how any individual out there may approach that domain. So yeah, this is just kind of a cursory overview of some of the works we've made over the past decade or so. And we'll start, yeah, with this idea of entry points. So sort of how we got into making public art, both temporary and permanent, and a path you might take to get into it.
I flipped this around just a little bit. So we're actually going to start by talking about ways that we see for all kinds of folks to get into public art.
Sure.
So one of the routes that we see as being a possibility for people who are more on the, I guess, emerging side of public art is definitely temporary work. It's a route that I think is a bit more accessible just because the overall stakes are lower. And that might be lower in terms of materiality. So usually you have both a smaller budget, but you also have less of a weight on your shoulders as an artist. So the work isn't necessarily expected to last for whatever, like 15 years, 50 years. Sometimes you've seen some calls where they expect your work to last that long, which is totally wild. And there's some like delicacy that you can incorporate into your work, which is really something lovely. We always kind of complain about how there's like a couple materials that seem to be really appropriate from a more regimented perspective in public art. And it's like the big four. There's stone, concrete, metal, and fiberglass. And those tend to be the materials that people view as being like, oh, like those are, you know, like these are it's the stuff of the cemetery, it'll last forever. And so, you know, it's nice to actually work in temporary ways because you can kind of flex more material desires alongside all kinds of other impulses.
Yeah, and additionally, in the world of temporary work, the sort of permissions requirements and permitting is usually less of a hoop through which to jump, just in terms of, you know, getting permission to put something up for a month or a week or a weekend is a lot easier than say, hey, this is going to be here for decades and it's going to, you know, there's a lot more process there. And so you can definitely have a little more flexibility and freedom with temporary work.
Yeah. And shout out to Lexington Art League who commissioned this piece. This is not actually, I think everyone thinks this is a recent piece because we just shared it on Instagram, but this piece is from 2014 called New Moon. And it was a work we installed twice, once indoors and once outdoors in a tornado warning. And it almost immediately got hit by an ice storm. So yeah, temporary work sometimes is in jeopardy, but we never could have installed this particular piece, which is made out of glass, in a permanent capacity. Something else that we are keen on in terms of entry points to public art making are self-initiated opportunities. This is, of course, this comes with the caveat of some degree of privilege. I think that it's important to think about where you place your energy, and this idea even of currency as energy in and energy out. And so of course, be careful with your self-initiated opportunities, but we have found that this is an incredibly amazing space to work, because you have all the freedoms of or not all of the freedoms, but sometimes you have some of the freedoms of not having a quote unquote boss or overseer in a self-initiated space.
Yeah, and both of the artworks in this example are works that we made without a commission opportunity or for any particular exhibition. But they're both works that were made quite affordably. Like the first version of this piece, The Deep Dark, that we made, that's on the left of the screen, we probably made it for under $500 of materials, and have since made tourable versions of the same artwork. And one of the reasons that the sort of self-initiated approach can work is because with at least temporary exhibition, a lot of prospective exhibitors kind of are more inclined to show an existing work than they might be to just commission something brand new. So if you can show that this work exists and it's sort of almost like a proof of concept, then I think it's a little more appealing for, say, an arts festival or an exhibitor in a temporary capacity to kind of take a chance on it. And the piece on the right is done on just like with a transparency on an old style overhead projector, and so again, quite minimal in terms of materials, but just to say that you can still kind of take a step into this world without having to deal with the huge budgets that are sometimes associated with public art.
Yeah, and I think it's important sometimes to think of these works as prototypes. So what's not clear necessarily about seeing the slide on the left is that the Deep Dark is like 20 gates, and they're all illuminated with, maybe this version was less than that,
12, I think.
And they're illuminated with LEDs. The LEDs were definitely the most expensive part of the work. And they were the most stealable, we found out later at Nuit Blanche Winnipeg. But I feel like I lost my train of thought. Anyway,
That's
next.
Okay. Sure. Another sort of entry point that we think, it's always good, and this applies probably beyond just public art, but life in general, is building some of the skills and techniques that are applicable to this sort of a career path. So in this case, the image on the left is some welding. Technical skills are great. Whatever you can build yourself or even have an understanding of these techniques, it helps you to kind of navigate the world of fabrication. On the top, there's some more this is another version of that piece, The Deep Dark, that's being worked on. And so just some kind of wiring and electrical stuff. And then some digital skills can be really handy too, and we'll talk about that a little later. This is a hilarious
rejected proposal.
Yeah, a unsuccessful proposal to make a floating desert island somewhere near Toronto.
And have our friend Jack Bride occupy it as a performance artist, and you could send him messages in a bottle on this squeaky clothesline, and he would then send you responses. But as we said, this will never happen.
This was a long shot pitch, but the slide is to show kind of just some of the skills of working with a modeling software or Photoshop to really communicate an idea that hasn't yet existed or that you haven't yet made.
Yeah, and I mean, skill building, I think it's worth also expanding into the conceptual framework of skill building, like reading books and looking into theory and looking at social justice movements and, just like anything that you view as being part of your practice. Hashtag art life. This is our beginnings. These are the slides that I inverted a little bit. People, I think, come from all sorts of beginnings, as we were referencing into public art. Our beginnings, it's hard to trace the beginning of our beginnings because, of course, you don't even begin when you begin. So we've sort of highlighted a couple of moments that seemed kind of important to the beginning of our work in public space. One of those moments is an artwork called Cloud.
Yeah, and this is an artwork we made in a temporary capacity. So it was for a one-night only exhibition for Nuit Blanche Calgary in 2012. And it's a sculpture made of 6,000 repurposed, burnt out incandescent light bulbs. And it's participatory in that people beneath the sculpture can pull on these pull chains and turn the individual lights beneath on and off, which affects the lighting on the surface of the piece and kind of emulates a thunderhead or like a thundercloud with lightning in it.
Yeah, it's very simple. Each one of these chains is just on, off, and it's a single light bulb. And yet somehow it just seems like one of those things that people can stand underneath for a very long time. And because this piece now is almost 10 years old, like it's coming up on 10 years in September, I feel like we've unpacked its secrets over time. But I think when we built the piece, we actually didn't quite know what we had accidentally kind of tapped into. And we'll talk a little bit more about that piece. But the other angle around the same time that very much drew us into public realm was a project called Rec City. It is way too big of a project to talk about. Some of you in this group know about it already. Hi, Joanne. But it's a project that existed in 9 houses, 3 garages, and a greenhouse in Calgary. And they were all scheduled for demolition. There were some artists running a gallery space out of one of the garages, 809, which is, I mean, it's been demolished. It's long gone at this point, but it was a kind of important space for artists who were looking for, an entry point to showing art after art school. It was a ton of sort of post-ACAD grads who were facilitating that space together. A really interesting and I think kind of important garage-based gallery space. Anyway, the block was being demolished, and so I was one of 8 co-curators. I use the term curator loosely because it certainly wasn't a traditional curatorial role, who facilitated artworks in these houses and garages and greenhouse. And over 150 artists participated, musicians, performers, all kinds of different disciplines, some really incredible folks. But of course, in a public space like this, where our sign was right on the C-train lines, it also was a real experiment in hyper-public. We had, I think, 10,000 people through the space in about a week, which was the biggest numbers we had certainly ever seen as facilitators, as artists probably at that point, except for Nuit Blanche, which was where Cloud was. So it was like a real boot camp, I guess, in terms of like what it means to facilitate something in public space for public folks. And what was really wonderful about it is that because it was right on the C train and because it didn't cost any money to come to, and because we didn't want any booze on site, at least we didn't facilitate alcohol on site, it ended up being this like fairly inclusive space. And I mean, the space was as inclusive as the neighborhood and the houses themselves were. So it ended up being, like tons of visitors who had nothing to do with arts and culture in the city, and like maybe had never gone to a gallery space before in their lives and would never actively seek that out, who then were, I think, sort of seduced by what Rec City was. What did Tom Johnson say about it? It was like Halloween birthday party.
Oh, yeah.
Something like that, like a little girl had said that to him. It was like Halloween birthday party. So it was like really fun, but also there were some quite critical works that were talking about gentrification and civic development and really looking at the kind of city that we want to live in, because of course these were lower income houses that were being demolished, and what was being built in their stead is currently there, it's about 115 unit condo building. So you can talk, that conversation goes very deep, and you can see how there's not enough time to really talk about it, but I think you can talk about up versus out, and you can talk about civic development, gentrification, density, just the way that neighborhoods kind of unfold over time. That project still has lots to say.
Yeah, after this transpired, I guess the work Cloud started getting a reasonable amount of international attention, and we ended up showing it quite extensively, I think to over 30 countries or so by this point. These photos past 2 have been in Singapore. This is in Prague. And it's interesting to take this work and travel with it, because we made it in a site responsive way. So the original photo that was in Olympic Plaza in Calgary was the space we designed it for. And we had that space in mind when we created the work. And so then to take it to all sorts of different spaces kind of really changes the meaning of the work for us. And it takes on a whole new light. This is in Romania, and you can just see how hectic the public spectacle can become.
This certainly wasn't like our favorite way of viewing this particular artwork. Like there's an amount of public that seems like a sweet spot, and because I think there was like a real desire for public work in that particular space when that festival happened in Romania, you could see just how hungry people were for it, but then the work itself almost couldn't be seen because the hunger just overwashed what was being sort of doled out to folks in terms of actual art making. So there was like no chance to absorb the work. And I think this is part of why we got really interested in longer term art making, was just this thought that like, you know, you get to make something that then gets to be a conversation with the people who spend time with it. And like that time sometimes is quite extended, you know, like if you're making something out of those like big four materials, like those things will probably last longer than we will as people, which is like both a huge amount of hubris to exude into the world, and also like this real possibility. And so yeah, we're just quite interested in that relationship. And like, I think we go back and forth about whether or not we're more interested in temporary public work or performative public work, like public work that we do with other people in our own backyard, like if, you know, what's most appealing. But it's kind of interesting to work on these different time scales. And that might be something that you folks out there are interested in also.
Yeah, in speaking about public art, you know, in a really simple way of looking at it is that it is art in a public space. So very much art outside of the gallery. And a huge part of how we kind of come to ideas and concepts for public works is informed by the space that they are designed for. So working in a site responsive way and trying to really do a thoughtful analysis of a site to inform concepts behind a work and what kind of work might fit in there. So we'll talk a little bit about site analysis and some of the questions that we ask to when we approach a site and think about making work there.
So this is an incomplete list, but this is something that we consider when developing a public work. Sometimes we don't consciously consider all of these things. Sometimes we haven't considered all of these things and it's been to the detriment of the project. But where are we is important to think about. And that's really like not to assume the response. Like where are we in geographic space, social space, functional space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Who uses this place and how do they use it? Who includes here non-human folks as well? What does this place feel like? So that's kind of, I really like that in terms of like an intuitive response. Like it's really, when we're making new work, it's always part of our process, whenever possible, to go and feel a place and like really just like sit in it and spend some time with it. Mm-hmm. What's the environment of the site? And I feel like in terms of more natural spaces, how does it change over the course of the year? But you could think that even about like a university or something, like, yeah, you know, who's using that space over time. Yeah,
even in urban spaces, thinking about the, you know, seasonal aesthetics, whether it's you know, in a northern city like Calgary, the winter has a very different feeling and function for spaces in public than summer. But also even daytime to nighttime can really change the feeling of a space.
It's easy to design for the ideal version of the site also. And I feel like that's a mistake.
Yeah.
You know, you want to at least consider the possible, some of the less ideal possibilities for how a space is either used or can be, like, you know, -40 and like very icy and like not especially appealing at night or whatever. Like that's important to design for that too, whenever possible.
Yeah, we also like to consider the history of the site and the future of the site. So thinking about where the site has been, what the function has been of the space and how it's been used, but how it also might be used in the future, what the kind of momentum of the space over time has been and where it maybe is going, and how an artwork could perhaps have impact on that direction. And, you know, this ties to the idea of what has changed here as well, and tensions and power dynamics. Public space can be really dynamic and volatile and all sorts of things, you know, and ever changing. And so it's just kind of really trying to take a broad look at public space and thinking of it beyond just the surrounding buildings and environment, but the function and the people and the history, like all of these aspects kind of make up the space. And the reason we really try to consider these things is because the artwork itself, in being placed in a public space, will be in conversation with the space. And so it's best to approach that conversation with some intention so that, you know, we inform the artwork with this context of the space, so that when it's in the space, it makes sense in some way. Maybe it's contrasting the space, maybe it's complementing it, maybe it's something completely different, but it's a deliberate choice.
As much as possible.
Yeah.
And I feel like all of this through the lens of like recognizing our personhood in the world and like the things that we are not able to see. I think something that we really subscribe to these days is this sort of like Italo Calvino idea of like every city, every place, every space being multiple cities, places, and spaces superimposed on top of each other. And that's how we really try and think about places, is recognizing that like we have one perspective, and we're like consciously trying to build our perspective because it's sort of a responsibility of working in public space. But also we will never be capable of understanding a place completely. And like, as soon as you kind of recognize that, I think this burden gets lifted, because you then have the responsibility to stay curious, or then I guess it's more of an invitation to stay curious about a place. Because if you recognize that you don't understand it, and you never will, all you're doing is just like collecting more knowledge and collecting more, just conversations about that space. I won't linger on this for too long. Some of the questions that we ask, which it might get a little bit repetitive here, once we kind of do our site analysis, is like, in developing a concept for a work, is what does this place need, if anything? What does this place desire? I think desire is something that is not often thought about in the built environment. And this is one of the things that art gets to do, that other aspects of design don't always get to do. And I think about it often. What would help this place see itself more clearly? What can art offer here? How can art empower, subvert, reflect, question, transcend the site, etc.? How can we, as specific people and artists, best put our skills to use here? Is art needed? Does art have any potential negative impacts that should be considered? This is something we've also, of course, learned the hard way. How can we work in concert with the people and environment here already? And can art help unlock the secrets of this place?
So we're going to do a reasonably quick case study of an installation we made, and just kind of how it was informed by a location. So those of you from Calgary might know this building is C-Space King Edward. If anyone doesn't know it, I'll just give a brief kind of description of what it is. So the sandstone portion of this building was a school from 1912, like a really traditional Calgary area school made of sandstone. And eventually the school fell out of use, and even somewhat dilapidated. There were flooding, and then there was some flooding in the additional wing, I guess. And the building has been repurposed by an organization in Calgary called C-Space that basically transformed it into a arts hub, arts incubator space. It has like artist studio spaces, nonprofit offices. Yeah, it's not too dissimilar to CASA. It is a theater. And we applied to a couple commissions to make public art at this space as part of the redevelopment. And so in looking at the space as a whole, we really considered the site and the building, and tried to think about, things that are specific to this space. And so on the left side of this image, there's a steel and glass wing that's being built in this image. It's still under construction by the look of things. And that wing is built in the place and roughly in the shape of a former sandstone wing that had collapsed in the 60s or something.
I think they had to force demolish it because it was collapsing. So
Yeah,
there was some sort of structural failure.
And so when the building was being redeveloped, this is, a pretty aggressive architectural move to make it distinctly different from the rest of the building. And so it has this really modern kind of contemporary architectural look with these materials compared to the sandstone, which is really historic to Calgary. And one of the things that occurred to us is the idea that the glass that's heavily used on the left side and the sandstone are actually in a lot of ways the same material in different states or through different processes. So the idea that sand and sandstone and glass are all the same material, and sometimes just changed as a result of time. A piece of glass can be crumbled into sand, or sandstone can erode into sand, and sand can be turned back into glass by applying heat or lightning strikes on a beach and these sorts of things. And so that was a big inspiration, as well as the kind of temporal difference between these architectural styles. So having a really traditional building and then something that's a little more contemporary and would be common a century later. And so the idea of time kind of came out to us, and through that, this icon of the hourglass or the sand timer.
I think it's important to pause for just a moment to acknowledge that we worked with a collaborator
on
this particular
very
project.
Much so.
Lane Shorty, who's also based in Mohkinstsis here with us,
Mhm.
our former roommate and super cool guy who's probably watching and being like, hey, you guys, don't forget this was a collaboration.
And
because he did an awful lot of labor on this project, which we will show you in a moment.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of final form of the artwork, but we're going to go back in time, as it were, and talk about how we got to this point. I guess it's also important to say that the call for submissions was to make an artwork for the inside of the building, but because the building itself is like essentially a public building, it is considered public art, even though it's not outdoor work. So the real delight was that we didn't have to deal with weather on most of the parts of the artwork, but of course there were other challenges which we could certainly get into pretty deeply, but yeah.
One of the aspects that informed the work was a public engagement component. And this is pretty common. It's an ask for a lot of public art commissions, actually, that there be some element of public engagement, whether that's making something truly interactive or participatory for the public, or just making sure that the artist is kind of connecting with members of the community before the work gets made, and perhaps that will inform their vision. But for this particular piece, we had time gathering sessions. And I'm just going to go back for 1 second just to describe the piece, if anyone hasn't seen it, or for those who haven't, rather. So it's 105 hourglasses that hang from the ceiling of this entryway atrium, and they each have a individual or discrete amount of sand in them that represents a specific amount of time. Half of them are on standardized intervals, like a half hour, 15 minutes, 1 hour, this sort of thing. And then the other half are on these personal increments of time. And so we solicited submissions from the community through sessions, as well as just kind of a box where you could drop them off. And the question was basically figure out the time it takes to do something significant in your life. So that the time it takes to blank, and then number of minutes and seconds.
And measure it yourself. So people were self-submitting and self-selecting, and we had both a physical box, and we also had a website where people could submit these increments of time. And then from those increments of time submitted, we essentially measured out the amount of time in sand into these hourglasses, and we made all these tags that indicate what the time in sand is measuring, but you don't get the actual time. So blow out that last stubborn birthday candle. That was probably very quick, but who knows? So 1 lap of breaststroke, somebody timed their breaststroke. There are therapies that have been timed. Perfect ways to cook hard-boiled eggs have been timed. I love get kicked out of the mall food court for dancing. That was like 4.5 minutes. Call mom, just all these different increments of like very personal and quite intimate time. Orgasm was one of them. I don't know how someone had the conscious mind to anyway, maybe they were actively doing it. They're taking one for the team. Anywho, so this is where Lane comes in. Of course, Lane was involved in all of the conceiving of this project and the design of this project, but his muscles specifically are featured here.
Yeah, and so all of these sort of points are just to describe basically the relationship the artwork has with the building and the space. And so, you know, the public engagement connects it to the people in the space, and then the concept is connected to the materials and the context of the building. A lot of the sand, a portion of it in the end, for the building was processed out of sandstone scrap. So when they did the renovations, they had to take small sections out here and there. And we were able to access some of these pieces and render it from, you know, chunks and blocks all the way down to basically suitable sand that was of a proper grain size. And so the, you know, some of the material in the piece is actually made of sand, from sandstone from the building. Yeah, I think we'll probably start moving along to the next section. It may be coming up quick, but these are some just finished photos of the piece. And some people interacting with it. So the next sort of step, this is a little more pragmatic, I would say, in terms of the kind of like, how do I get into making public art? One thing that can be challenging is visualizing an artwork that hasn't been made yet. And so how do you communicate this idea that you have, even though it doesn't exist yet, but to, you know, to win a submission or to encourage, you know, to basically convince someone that this piece is worth making. And so there are a few different techniques we're going to look at. We're just going to kind of go through. We've got like basically initial concept renderings and then the final image. So here's the design board for the piece yesterday, today, tomorrow that we just looked at, and then there's an image on the right of the piece.
This is interesting though, because the process at C-Space was a public process, so they actually published all of the submissions. So I want to say the shortlisted, there were maybe like
5 for each site or
something like that, like 3 to 5 for each site.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got to see everyone else's design boards for the same site. So it was an open process, and it was pretty fascinating in the end just to see all the different ways that people were conceiving of these spaces and trying to respond site specifically.
Mm-hmm.
This was our very preliminary design, and it ended up being redesigned many, many times, but it's not that far off.
Yeah.
Ultimately, which was kind of an interesting thing. We also had to, as part of this call for submissions, build a maquette, which was hilarious. You can see that we've used marbles here to symbolize tiny hourglasses, and I think those are little light bulbs for the hourglass on the outside of the building. And we haven't shown you the hourglass on the outside of the building. There is an hourglass on the outside of the building.
Just to speak a bit to technique though, in the first image, we were using this on the left, most of this was made in a 3D modeling software. There's a great program called SketchUp that you can use for free online that has a lot of tutorials. And so if you need to render an idea in 3D space, this can be a good way to do it. And then taking images from that program and blending them with photos in a program like Photoshop or something is a great way to kind of tie it all together and address some of the details. So this image on the left is a mix of images from SketchUp as well as images from real life, and then probably some stock imagery too, like the actual hourglass.
Yeah, and I feel like often with these images, like all you're really trying to do is communicate clearly a vision that you have. And so it's like, how do you get it out of your head and into somebody else's? You know, like how do you essentially share what you're imagining and share it in the best possible light for that idea? And sometimes like there's some strategy to it to make it more appealing, and sometimes it's just utter chaos. I still think this is like a hilarious rendering of cloud. It's not that far off.
No.
I think the real version it actually looks nicer than the rendering, which is you know, something.
Yeah.
Also, it's like definitely over 6,000 light bulbs. So I don't know what I was thinking. I'm sure there was like no math that went into this. Yeah. And this is rendering number 2. I was too embarrassed to show rendering number 1.
Yeah.
I inverted this because I thought it was nice to actually look at the finished image.
Oh, sure. Okay. So this is a piece we made for another temporary piece. This was originally supposed to be up for 6 months and I think extended to 9, but it was a temporary installation on the facade of Para Museum in Istanbul, kind of to mark their 10-year anniversary. So it's a modern to contemporary arts center. And this is a piece made out of eyeglass lenses that conceptually speaks to the kind of role of the museum in society and how kind of the lens through which you see yourself at a museum or through which you see society. And here's the concept rendering. So this is just essentially probably Photoshop onto images of the building. And you can see the kind of back and forth where it's in the ballpark, certainly.
It's definitely, the ring is stronger than the rendering would have you think. But of course, those are those pragmatic things of like, you know, we wanted to make something out of eyeglass lenses. Okay, they can't just float. And so like, how do you think about engineering then? And it was really great. The Para Museum folks, this building is from the 1890s. And we were kind of concerned because if we did something like this on a building in Calgary, I think there'd be a conversation to be had with heritage activists, and quite rightfully. I mean, you know, I think sometimes we're very bad at preserving our history or even acknowledging our past in general. But we asked the folks who ran this space, like, hey, like, is there going to be, you know, will there be people in the community who are upset that we're doing something on the facade of this, you know, like more heritage building? And they're like, basically they said, they're a dime a dozen, no one's going to care, which ended up being true. But what was wonderful is that they had recently done a restoration of this space. And so they were able to work with the heritage restorer to mount this ring. And so it was both engineered properly, but also done in a way so it could be remediated when it needed to be removed. And so that was actually a really wonderful thing that the museum thought about and thought through when they commissioned this piece.
Mm-hmm.
this piece I think is so funny in terms of the rendering to reality.
Yeah.
To look at now. So this is a piece in Edmonton in the brewery district, and it's a piece called Carbon Copy. We were very clear with Carbon Copy when we applied to do the actual work that like this is not the final car. Like the car on the left in the rendering is not going to be the car that was going to be involved in the final sculpture. And we built like a little maquette with like a muscle car. Like it was just like all over the map kind of, but like it was to communicate the idea. And because we got to do a verbal pitch, which was sort of terrifying, and then we got to go to the water park. But it was like one of those things where you could like say that openly, like, you know, we're
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it's not going to look like this, but it's going to look better than this, which is actually how I feel. We worked with F&D Scene Changes here in Calgary on this piece. We've worked with them a couple of times, and they did a really phenomenal job with the auto body work and the decisions that were made. And we were constantly going into the fabrication space to kind of, I'm sure it was very annoying, but like, you know, go into like make sure certain things are up to like our particular standards. And I'm sure they were doing all kinds of work, just making sure it was up to their standards also. But
yeah. And we'll talk to the sort of collaborative process right after this about all the different kind of people that get involved in a bigger installation. Here's I think this next one is a little more conceivable as like how a rendering gets made. So this is a piece that we ended up making for Winter Stations, which is a design competition on the shore of Lake Ontario and in the beaches community of Toronto. And this is basically our design board versus what the finished product ended up like. But you can see it's just, you know, it's a little more romantic the way it's rendered on the left with the, you know, super beautiful sky that you would never see in a major urban center and these sorts of things. But it gives the impression of what the piece might look like. And I think the whole idea with being able to come up with a rendering is really kind of selling the concept and presenting the idea in a way that, you know, allows you to share your imagination and the potential for a piece.
Yeah, and then this is the rendering of the inside of the piece. So basically everyone who submitted to this design competition, it was like quite a competitive thing. It was sort of aimed at architects and designers, but we know a couple other artists who have like made their way into this competition. So I think it's worth looking into Winter Station's design competition, just because all you submit essentially is like 2 renderings. And so the first image you saw was not a complete rendering. Like there was a little bit of text on the side and like a title, just something to like really communicate what it was all about. And then this was to show like you can climb up inside of the piece and there's this like fur lined interior, and you can hang out in there. And the theme that year was freeze and thaw. And so it was sort of this thought of like the spaces that we warm in and like cultures of warming. Again, this was done in collaboration with Lane Shorty. So we got a shout out to our constant companion, Lane. But so, and then you can see this is what it actually looked like to climb up inside. So we worked with the fabricator for all the works was Atelier 15, who've since changed their name, but I can't remember what to. And they actually fabricated the work almost completely. So we just came for the final installation, which is not the way that we prefer to work, not the way that we knew we would be working, but was like quite a treat in this particular case. Yeah, and then we created the fur lining out of like repurposed fur coats, some real fur and some faux fur. We try wherever possible to be ethical, but you know, that's more and less possible. And I think there's a relationship with cultures of warmth and fur anyway.
No new fur anyways.
Yeah, so that's another rendering, and we just have a couple more that we'll show you briefly.
This is to show that, you know, if you don't have a lot of computer skills, you can still communicate an idea through drawing or other mediums. These are drawings Caitlin made for this piece. I love them, they're so nice. That was about kind of ghost homes in Japan. So these there's a huge issue with kind of people not inheriting buildings from deceased relatives due to a number of factors. But suffice to say, there are a lot of empty buildings, especially outside of the major centers. And so these are kind of veiled houses, or the idea of like a house beyond the veil.
Yeah, and also
becoming
like
a ghost.
like a bed sheet ghost that you know, there's like something kind of jokesy about quite a bit of our work,
Yeah.
but sometimes the results are more serious than others. And this was a piece that was so wonderful to make. We had a whole team of folks, unseen but credited in our hearts.
Yeah, and this is a project that has not been realized and likely will not be, but it's just to show, again, this is like without any Photoshop, just in the modeling software. And if you're someone who wants to get into public art and you don't have a lot of kind of digital skills, that doesn't mean you can't share these ideas. Sometimes it just means you need to reach out to someone or hire somebody who does have these skills. It's not necessarily going to be a massive amount of work for them, but to just communicate an idea. Or you can build maquettes, or you can make drawings. But I think a huge part of bringing something into reality is communicating the concept visually.
And I actually added a couple images here because it's just kind of it's just kind of fun to see like the ways that you end up interpreting something. So we spent quite a while with this project before it ended up getting canceled due to all kinds of factors, but we're going to blame COVID. And it was a series of birdhouses that were precariously stacked. So like imagine like a Shel Silverstein drawing kind of. They were all modeled after miniatures of buildings in the neighborhood that had been demolished. So the thinking was things that were no longer present in the built environment, and this idea of something being for the birds or no longer considered valuable in some way. And it ranged in scale and sort of beauty, I guess, from like very commercial spaces that maybe needed to be changed out and should be demolished, to like really lovely houses, like sandstone buildings even, that had been knocked down in the neighborhood. Just a couple more renderings to show you how we communicated this initially to the folks that were going to commission it. I just put this slide in here as a reminder to myself to just say at some point that your job in terms of communications kind of sits on either side of your artwork. So there's the job of communicating the idea to get to the point where you're commissioned to do something, which is obviously a lot of work and really essential. And you build your skills over time to do that more clearly and with more intention. But there's also this job on the other side of the artwork and throughout making the artwork, if you've been lucky enough to win the commission, which is basically documenting your process, taking lots of photographs, taking video wherever possible. If you can, make a website, because these are the things that sustain your practice moving forward. And so that's been really, I can't even overestimate, I don't think, like how useful that's been to our practice and sustaining our work. I come from a background as a sort of, I mean, not quite self-taught photographer. Like I took photo classes at art school, but it wasn't my field of expertise by any stretch of the imagination. And just to have like a camera always with us to like document the process and like really sort of integrate others' eyes into what we saw as being valuable about our own work has been like really amazing. And we've gone on to work with a number of documentary filmmakers, particularly Ramina Shaggy Yazdi, who's been really amazing and essential in capturing like important moments from various works. But we've worked with a bunch of folks. Dane Alsifer did really wonderful documentaries for the C-Space projects. They're all available on the internet. If you want to see us talking even more after this conversation, you're gonna be tired of us by now.
Yeah, and so speaking of other folks involved in these projects, bigger projects especially tend to be a huge collaboration, just by necessity of scale and ability and stakeholders and permissions and bureaucracy and all of there's so much involved. So we just thought we'd do a quick case study, and this is kind of pretty much the last section of our talk, but about a piece and all of the sort of steps involved. So this piece is called Light Keeper, and it's an installation we made with a local architecture studio in Calgary called
architectural design.
Architectural design.
Very important distinction.
Called Studio North. So we collaborated with them to make this installation. Just briefly, it's a tower kind of inspired by the lighthouse as a concept. So this, which is often, it's a beacon to mark a place at night and in the daytime, and to basically steer ships away from the rocks and these sorts of things. And so this piece was designed as a light-based artwork for this park in waterfront area of Toronto. and it projects these rainbow waves that move across the urban porch of this new park, as well as a projection of the moon that changes depending on the phase of the moon. And the waves themselves are generated with just like it's a metal halide bulb. So it's not a digital projection, but it's actually a single source light bulb, similar to what you might find in a street light that is being projected through a lens. We'll get into it a little bit, but that then refracts the light into these rainbow waves. But a piece like this, it's reasonably complex to accomplish. And so we'll just talk about the different parties and steps involved in the project management aspect, because it can get dizzying. This is some of the inspiration. These photos are from the Scottish Lighthouse Museum in Fraserburgh in North Scotland that we happened to be near there and went, and it was mind-blowing. Some of the like third or fourth order lenses are so big you could stand up inside of them, and they're just these like incredible prismatic objects. The Fresnel style lens, really beautiful, but they have this incidental sort of effect of creating rainbows when light hits them, even though their function is to actually kind of straighten light and focus it into a beam that can travel as far as possible. But just the incidental. So we kind of approached it in the opposite way, where we made this lens. This is an early prototype that is designed to take light from a single source, and instead of focusing it, it's spreading it apart and specifically into spectral light. So this photo is just to talk about kind of the prototyping phase, coming up with a concept, and then really trying to develop techniques to get the effect that we wanted.
Yeah, and you'll see that this was in Studio North when they were in Kensington, when they're in their Kensington location.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a team process. So there were Matt and Mark were our kind of main contacts, but then it ended up involving like quite a bit of their studio, which was pretty rad to have access to like their laser cutting facilities, and also I think Nick was their intern.
Nick
then.
Hamill, who was instrumental in this project.
Yeah.
And then this is a prototype installation that was kind of a pop-up for Glow Festival in Calgary, but it was a doubled sort of as a proof of concept for us to test some of the effects with this lens. So it's just on sort of theater truss rigging with a couple sheets of mirrored acrylic to see what kind of reflections and effects we might get and how it would perform in this setting. This is a pretty straight ahead sort of conceptual functional drawing. So the light that makes the moonbeam is actually generated by spotlight at the base of the sculpture, and then it goes up to the top and bounces off a mirror that then reflects it onto the ground, where the rainbow light is generated from that sort of cylindrical lens that sits at the top of the piece. This is just to show, some of the sort of conceptual and construction based aspects of this. So this is a pretty simplified but exploded view of the different pieces that go into making up the tower, and then the functional elements of the piece. So there's a structural skeleton on the inside that's ends up being completely engineered, and then it's clad with stainless steel paneling, and then everything has to mount up with the lenses and the housings that we made to sort of accommodate the functional light effects. These are just an example of some shop drawings and engineering drawings. This is from the stainless steel contractor that did the actual sheeting and stainless work on it.
Yeah, it was through F&D Scene Changes again, local fabricator. We've had great luck working with them, and it's been really awesome. They definitely are best known for their large scale sets that they build, but they've also made like a bunch of the hard coated foam work at the Calgary Zoo, etc.
They do all sorts of
they
stuff.
do all kinds of
Lots
work.
of Broadway production sets.
Yeah.
And here's an engineering drawing just showing some of the sort of foundation and structural elements. And so this piece sits on a giant concrete block that had to be we had to hire contractors to cast it in place on the site and to certain specifications with rebar and engineers inspections. And so as these pieces get big, you do have to consider all of the engineering requirements, and it's part of getting permissions to actually install something at scale.
The other thing I guess is important to say, like, because when I look at this, I'm like, I don't know if I could read this without Wayne, this particular drawing. And you do get better at all of this stuff. Like, I don't think anyone's jumping into Lightkeeper without several steps in the middle, you know, like you go from the more temporary and short-term and festival-based works, and then you kind of like work your way up and then maybe back down again, depending on your preference. But it is nice to have some folks on your team, like even having the Studio North folks to be like, to put their foot down at key moments when we really needed it, and to know that within the industry of architectural design, like certain things are appropriate to ask for from your client, and certain things are not appropriate to ask for from a contractor. And so that actually was really great, because I think Wayne and I will say yes to most things, and we're learning to do that less. And some of that learning has been through our collaborators, certainly.
Yeah. Well, and you're very much stepping into the world of making public infrastructure. And so all that comes with that in terms of, contracts and negotiation and contractors and all of this. This is just a brief glance at some of the actual control systems for this piece. So there are two separate systems that control the various lighting elements. That involves coding. So, things like programming microcontrollers to respond to sensors and data to basically affect how a piece behaves.
Can we shout out to Paul Jarvie?
Yeah, Paul Jarvie helped a lot with this. With this code, especially the yesterday, today, tomorrow code, though, that was totally baffling to me. This stuff's a little more straight ahead. Here's a shot at F&D scene changes of the piece being welded. And so, this is, again, just speaking to the collaboration and part of the kind of the whole team that ends up working on a piece and the different hands that it goes through before it gets finished. This is at Reagan Industries, where they're doing the sheeting. So they're adding the stainless steel cladding to the piece. This is doing some fit ups with the lens we made at the at Reagan's shop, just to make sure it will all fit up and align.
It's always smart to make sure things fit before you put the thing on a crane or whatever and like load it into the park. Just like do it at hand height. It will be way faster. Like just take it from us, okay? And
then the logistics of shipping and sending something across the country to be installed, and then site installation plans and permissions to park cranes and heavy equipment. And there's a lot of different balls in the air, and actually installing a piece. Ta-da, it's done, there it is. But just to kind of speak to that, like it is a huge team effort, and probably like people involved with that project maybe upwards of 50, I would guess, in terms of like everyone who had to be emailed and looped in and had some hand in it. And then of course you have this like wonderful moment where you get to stand back and then walk away, and the neighbors get to keep the work. And like what's been really lovely about this particular site is that there's a couple neighbors. You can see the balconies on the right hand side of this image. There are a couple neighbors who are like really proud of the piece, who live in those condos. And they get to look at the lake during the day, and they get to look down at this like rainbow piece at night. This particular development's really cool because they also have low-income artist housing. It's on the non-lake side of the building, but it still exists in sort of downtown-ish or waterfront-ish Toronto. So it's a pretty interesting space to have a work then get to live. And because it's quite a meditative piece, we built it to be slow and like gentle and just like wash across the space. I think it's something where it's like, it will hopefully age well in terms of concept. And of course, maintenance is an ongoing thing. We've gone back once to maintain it. It's one of those things that you just need to bank on basically needing to maintain your work over time, or someone needing to maintain your work over time. But in terms of like actual like analog projection artworks, like I think it will feel good for a long time, because who doesn't like a rainbow? So just to wrap up, we're going to briefly talk about some of the lessons we've learned the hard way, mistakes we've made over the years. I like to say this, AKA where we gloss over years worth of mistakes, but in frustratingly brief and insufficient and BuzzFeed worthy kind of lengths. So it's just a very brief version of some of the mistakes that we've made, and it will be a couple of pages. So sit tight. This is the end of the talk. So just relax and have a sip of tea. Some of the mistakes we've made include assuming lots of things, assuming it will be easy, assuming it will be cheap, assuming it will be fast or unfold in a reasonable amount of time, which is a big assumption you want to make, but it's never been true in terms of
the municipally funded public art that we've worked on. Assuming we will be blindly supported by our commissioning body. No one will blindly support you. You have to make arguments at some point, and compelling, reasoned truths in some capacity to move forward. Do you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to keep going through. So assuming there will be notes from engineers or subject matter experts, which there often are, and they're worth listening to, you know, these people are experts in their fields. But through all of these sort of filters, I think it's your job as the artist often to try to maintain the vision of the work as much as possible through the kind of rigors of engineering and public space and budget constraints and all of these things. Whatever you can do to kind of preserve the core of the idea is a challenge.
Assuming bureaucracies speak in one voice with absolute authority, that is a mistake. Bureaucracies never speak in one voice. They often speak in many, many voices saying different things. And that's where their absolute authority kind of falls apart. And so it's important to know that, actually. Assuming we can't push back with a good argument is something that has been a mistake we've made and will never make again. You can always push back.
Assuming that because public art is accessible publicly, it is publicly accessible. This has to do with, you know, who's allowed to be in a certain space, or, you know, what sort of restrictions are in place in some spaces for some people to be able to visit them and access artworks. Assuming that our view of a place is the only view. So that's, again, with the idea of a site analysis, really thinking about the different people that use a space and how it's so many overlapping spaces depending on your perspective.
Assuming a place can be defined in any solid way. Assuming the body commissioning an artwork is more important than the people who will be experiencing it every day. Assuming we understand the situation before we've put in the time.
Or assuming a public artwork should exist at all, here and now, created by us.
More mistakes we've made. Self-censoring is something I've been thinking about a lot. And I think more or less every year, Wayne and I have a crisis where we're like, should we continue working in public art? Like, it is really a difficult field. It can be quite disheartening and dispiriting. And I think that might be especially true in this part of the world. Like, and I guess that's an incredibly privileged thing to say. I mean, specifically in terms of sometimes the public responses to public art in cities like Calgary, Mohkinstsis, and other more conservative places in Alberta. So sometimes it's disheartening, although I guess it's all relative. So self-censoring good ideas because somebody somewhere one time thought maybe it would be hard or ill-advised. Don't do that. Self-censoring material choices because the materials we want to use are not traditionally considered durable, i.e. the big four that we talked about. So metal, stone, concrete, or fiberglass. Self-censoring our designs because they will be difficult for a traditional fabricator to build or require extra time and care to execute well. Self-censoring
our ideas because somebody wants something easier to sell to the public. Self-censoring our voice and the voices of our collaborators because there's a belief that the general public can't handle complex thinking. And that's like, the public is so great as an audience and they're so surprising. And it's like what public viewers bring to an artwork and how they understand it. And, you know, basically everyone has their own personal histories. And so we're constantly surprised by the way people read artworks in public space in a positive way.
And the depth of their understanding and like the depth of their relationships and the richness of public space. Self-censoring our concepts because we assume based on previous experiences that they won't be supported. And that's something that that's a mistake we continue to make and that we need to constantly be correcting. Like, don't just assume that that you have to self-censor because you have experienced like really difficult clients or like a really bureaucratic situation or difficulty in the past. Like, don't just assume that someone's going to say no, because if you assume that, you never give them a chance. And I guess it's an important thing to note, this thing about compromise, because we always talk about compromise. There will be compromises if you're going to work in the field of public work. Unless you're like a horrible person, you have to you literally have to compromise because you're imposing to some extent something onto public space. You're imposing either an object or a performance or a viewpoint onto public space. And so you need to be prepared for the two-way conversation that entails, which was an insight that we learned at a public art it was just like a conversation at the library. Like some person who had nothing to do with public art was like, oh, I always thought public art should be a two-way conversation. And it seems so basic, but it should be true always, that it should be a two-way conversation. There should be space for give and take and compromise.
Yeah. And don't let your best concept escape without carefully examining why. And, you know, part of this is, again, that idea of really trying to preserve the heart or the core of an idea through the rigors of getting it actually realized.
I think this is the last slide.
Okay.
So yippee. I know this is awfully long, but these are things that we can tell you and you can screenshot and then maybe think about in your own time. So another mistake that we've made is believing that the contract can't be negotiated. The contract can always be negotiated. Don't be afraid of negotiating contracts. Get what you need. Believing that the timeline is solid. Believing that working with a fabricator, engineer, or material expert means that you don't need to do the research and generally understand the process and methodology of building an artwork. This is something I've learned from Wayne, which is basically that you should approach even people who are experts in their own field with some understanding of what they're doing, because there's always space for, again, negotiation. Like there's always space for like engineering in a more aestheticized way. There's always space for fabricating in a slightly different way to like prioritize different parts of the project. The more you know about the methodology that even someone who's very much an expert in their field, and you're not an expert in that field, the more you know about their methodology, the better you will be at communicating with each other to get something that's ultimately more to your mutual satisfaction.
Yeah. Believing that leaving a public art piece behind in another city means we can forget about it.
That's a mistake. You can never forget about it. It's yours forever in some way. It's a baby.
Yeah, and you also, a mistake would be believing the public has nothing to contribute. They have so much to contribute. It's incredible to work in public space. But believing that the public is one thing, has one voice, is uniform in any way, a very diverse group, and you know that's the exciting part, I think. Believing that our relationship with people and places will not continue to evolve over time. Everything is always changing in public space. Believing that artists and artworks don't participate in the power dynamics of a public space is a mistake. You're always participating in some power dynamic, and the more that you're aware that that's always there, yeah, the better you can be at sort of navigating the problems of those power dynamics. Believing that meritocracy will enable all artists to access public art commissions equally, and that we don't need to step up, share our privilege, experiences, and resources, and help create access points for other practitioners is a mistake. Believing that the job begins with the conception of the artwork and ends when the artwork is installed. That's not real. Like that thing, you're tethered to that thing forever. And you might wish that you could step away at times, but yeah, I kind of genuinely believe that they're like these public artworks that you leave in the world. They're your credit and responsibility. Like I think those two things are entwined. And so you need to recognize that that's an ongoing relationship that you're going to have with that work in that other place. And there'll be other people in relationship with that work too. Sometimes people who will maintain the work for you or people who will oversee the work for you. But as long as that thing is out there in the world, you're tied to it in some way. Believing that the relationships we build as we develop our public art practice are not ours to keep. They indeed are. Believing that keeping good relationships won't require work or gratitude and recognition over time. It needs to be nurtured and maintained, just like artworks. Believing that our artworks won't require maintenance. Work in public space, like anything in public space, you know, a house, a road, a car, all of these things do require maintenance, and it's a big piece in how a public, you know, getting it just to the point of installation is one thing, and there's a whole nother chapter that begins at that point. Yeah.
That's
all right.
Enough of us talking, and we thank you for your patience and your time, and we would love to hear your questions if we can be helpful in any way. Thanks. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I learned so much. Like I don't know much about public art, so that was really great. We do have some questions. I see 3 right now in the Q&A box, and I think some comments are coming out here. I'll start with the first one that I see. It says, how is the funding secured if it is self-initiated, grant-based, funded by site owner?
Yeah, so I think what we actually meant with self-initiated is basically you're paying for it yourself, which is why we use some like kind of cheaper examples of works that we've made that have either been with things that we have lying around already, or things that didn't cost too much money. Because I mean, I think about like any sort of studio practice artist, and you're always kind of spending some amount of money on your practice. And so it's just sort of like directing, that's why the energy in, energy out thing is important. You don't want to spend too much of your money. But that said, grants are also a thing.
Yeah, you can definitely, if you initiate your own opportunity, you know, if there's like a place you want to exhibit a work or install it, and you can navigate the permissions required, be it permanent or temporary, there are ways of self-funding these things too. But yeah, I think we were more in the idea of self-initiated. It was kind of the idea of, you know, you don't need to wait to land a commission to try something. There are, you know, affordable installations you can make, or like proofs of concept experiments, without having to have a massive budget always.
Yeah, thank you. I'll ask the second one now here. What are your suggestions for someone who is not at all handy and does not have any trade skills to get involved in public art? For example, should I meet with different manufacturers to see how they can help?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's always good to build those skills, but you don't necessarily have to be a tradesperson or an architect, or, you know, people come at public art from all sorts of different backgrounds. And if you're coming at it from, you know, more of a studio practice background, that's great. And there are fabricators who you can meet with. There are some fabricators who approach public art making in a sort of a different way. I'm speaking right now specifically, at least in Calgary, of heavy industries who have taken a tact where they tend to work more with a roster of artists that they'll basically initiate an opportunity, often with, say, a real estate developer, and then they will find an artist who is the right fit, but they will be the ones to fabricate the work. And so you can reach out to fabricators to at least, you know, most of them are super excited to talk about art. There are a bunch of great ones in Calgary, including F&D Scene Changes, Carvel Creative. Heavy, again, is taking this more kind of turnkey approach with artists, where it's more about the artist just coming up with a concept, and they'll take care of a lot of the fabrication stuff.
We've also worked with Jag Industries,
Yeah.
who did an amazing job with the metalwork on this flight of stairs that we designed, and they did such a good job.
Yeah.
So there's no lack of people out there with the skills that you need. I feel like, though, like before you take that step, I think there's something about collaboration that maybe doesn't get talked about in the way that it could be, which is that you are skill sharing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're collaborating with someone else, like the part of what's wonderful about collaborating with anyone, part of the reason we started collaborating in the first place, is that it seemed like the sum of our parts was greater than each of us individually. And so there's something about like finding the people who have the skills that you are lacking, and then bringing the skills that you have, and sort of like finding your rhythm in that seems kind of important. Like, I'm not especially handy. I've learned to be more handy over the years from Wayne, but because he had the background as a machinist, like it's been really helpful, because I went through the drawing program, like I was doing drawings and like taking photos, like that was my scene. So
yeah. And I mean, conversely to that, I've learned a lot conceptually from Caitlin about kind of how to understand and conceive of art, you know, in a more academic, artistic way.
Thank you. The third question that I have here is, what happens when you create a budget and you realize you were way out of touch? How do you tackle an accurate budget?
That's hard. I hope no one is asking because it's happened or happening actively to them. Yeah,
that can happen. I mean, a budget is a tricky thing, especially in the world of infrastructure. Things get pretty expensive pretty quick. And so, you know, it's always good to leave a contingency in these sorts of things in your budget in case there are overruns in certain areas. And in general, I mean, it can be pretty hard to budget. As much as possible, try to be thorough about getting quotes and for every step of the way and all the things you might not think of. But if a budget does overrun, sometimes we've had to do this once. You can go back to a client and say, hey, you know, I thought we could pull this off with this budget. We can't. Is there a possibility of, you know, accessing more funding?
Don't make a habit of it, because you do sign a contract that says that you're not going to do that. But if something gets out of hand, I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask, because again, it's like that whole self-censorship thing of like, if you don't ask, someone can only ever say no because they've never had a chance to say yes. And so if there is if this question is being asked by a person who's like in that situation right now, like, don't be afraid to reach out at least to the person who's commissioning, and just kind of let them know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get to that point, like if someone's like, okay, let's talk about it. Something that we have heard several times is a bit strategic is actually to come into that presentation showing what the difference is that so for example, if you're like, I need another whatever, if you give me this much money, I can do these things to this artwork. If you give me this much money, this is your medium kind of possibility that will come out of the artwork. And if you give me this, like the minimum amount of money, these are like, I can just like finish it real quick. And what we found with that is that usually people will almost always choose the medium path.
Yeah, not to say we have a ton of experience asking for more money. I think
we try not to do that.
It's happened once.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's some, I don't want to get into it.
The other way to deal with that though is the concept of value engineering. And so if you do come into a point where things are looking a lot more expensive than you thought, you have to start identifying places where you can save money, which is often to the detriment of the project or the concept, but you know, it's this compromise of getting something built.
Well, and as soon as you do this once, you're going to look around at all the public art in the built environment, and you're going to see how value engineering happens everywhere. Like there's a couple of artworks that I look at downtown that have been there since the 80s. And I feel like I kind of was like, meh about them before we started making public art ourselves. And now I look at them and I'm like, oh, okay, that's what they were going for, but they had to value engineer this, and they had to like change out that material, and like, oh, they had to make it really high so that no one could climb up and touch it. And like, you know, suddenly you like see all the like reasons why certain decisions sort of had to be made. And it does make you a little bit more gracious with public artwork, whether or not it should, which I guess is also a disheartening thing to say. And I don't mean it that way. It's just kind of, yeah, you see how the sausage is made, and then maybe you enjoy the sausage more.
That makes sense. The follow-up question to that was, do you work side by side with the fabricator from the idea conception?
Not always. We don't always work with a fabricator at all. Some projects are very driven by a fabricator, and some of them are quite removed from that. It just depends on the scale and what sort of techniques and materials are being used. There are definitely instances though in fabricators that, you know, prefer what's called a turnkey approach, where you basically present the idea, and then the fabricator takes it from there and renders it into art, and you might just check in a few times throughout the process and give approvals or notes and these sort of things. And there are a lot of people, a lot of, you know, established public artists who work that way, and there are also a lot of, you know, artists who always have a hand in the work. We'd like to have a hand in as much as possible where it's appropriate, but you know, we don't do any fiberglass work ourselves, for example. So on a piece like Carbon Copy, you know, we're not really able to, we won't like learn how to fiberglass just to make this piece. And so that's part of hiring a fabricator. Another route you can go sometimes, depending on what your needs are, is you don't necessarily need to have an art fabricator. Say you just need like a few pieces laser cut or some aluminum welded or something like specific. You can just hire an industrial fabricator or an industrial company that just does those types of things.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's also a way of saving money sometimes, because part of what you're doing when you're paying an art fabricator is you're like also paying their overhead, and like they do make things easier for you, like they coordinate all the different pieces.
Yeah, and they have a great understanding of some of the sensitivities around something being aesthetically considered in an artwork, as opposed to just needing to stand up.
Maybe they told us the thing about making sure it fits before you install the. Yes, they did. They told us that thing. This is an amazing thing we learned from F&D Scene Changes.
Oh yeah, actually.
Which was basically, if you're making something, if someone somewhere is fabricating a footing for an artwork for you, and you're making the artwork that's supposed to slide onto that footing and be bolted down, make a plywood template of your side of the sculpture and mail it to the people who have the footing, so that they can make sure it fits before you show up with your thing and your crane that you're paying for by the hour, and like just make sure. And like that's been some of the best advice that I've ever gotten.
Always use a template.
Always use a template.
That's great, thank you. How many submissions do you put out a year versus projects that are accepted within a year?
Oh my God, this is such a hilarious question to ask this year. We have had the worst year I think ever.
I don't know about that.
Wayne,
I look on the sunny
I've
side.
been writing most of the submissions and you are a sunshiny boy. But honestly, like this year has been terrible. Like I want to say that we're like batting 20-0. Like it's real bad. But then there have been other years where we've gotten everything we've applied for. And I don't know what it is, like if it's something in the water. I don't know if it's this idea of like maybe post-pandemic, like people are like, oh, it's time to do things. So I'm going to apply for absolutely everything. You know, some years are just bad and you won't know until they're happening. And then in other ways, like I guess I can't complain too much because of the success of Cloud, what's happened is we've been able to leverage that sort of like 10-year-old artwork to make new pieces. So on that side of things, like if someone is like, oh, I'm interested in this one sculpture that is the sculpture that went viral, and like for some reason it's not available, or you know, or they have a really interesting space or something, sometimes we're able to like use that as a way to like make to sort of get new commissions. So CC saw the eyeglass piece, Paramuseum wanted to show Cloud, and they're like, it literally won't fit through your door. Like your door is too small for this artwork. Would you be interested in commissioning a new piece for your 10th anniversary? And that was, you know, that opened some really amazing doors.
Yeah, I would say that just to answer that question really directly, I would guess that's like probably around the 10% mark in terms of like successful applications.
But let's not do the math.
Yeah,
I feel like it'll
know.
be too disheartening. Or maybe it'll be great. I don't know.
One thing that is nice is a lot of public art calls will have a 2-stage call where there's like a request for qualifications, and then from that they'll select a short list. And in the short list, you're typically paid a fee to actually kind of develop an idea to a level that you could present it. And so you're not having to put in all this like conceptual equity and, you know, develop a proposal just on a hope that you might get it. At least you're compensated if you don't. And then you have your idea and maybe it fits somewhere else later.
Yeah.
Or you can learn from it.
Those are like the more municipally commissioned pieces tend to have like some sort of fee for developing the concept passage. Because you do, yeah, because you're calling everyone and getting your quotes so that you don't propose something where you'll run over budget too. So like, yeah, all those, anyway, I'm trailing off.
Thank you. Is never having used a material or process before typically an obstacle when applying for public art competitions? If so, how do you convince the jury of your capacity to execute a project with new to you skills involved?
I mean, I think if it's a material that you're not experienced or familiar with, that's a situation where you would, I would typically, at least my impulse is to say we would hire, you know, fabricator X who's an expert in whatever glass fiber reinforced concrete, or, you know, whatever the material is that we don't have any personal experience with. And, you know, that's kind of on an infrastructure level project like this, you're not expected to be the person who's like building every single aspect of it. It is a huge team project. And so there's no shame in saying, you know, we want this thing made out of fiberglass, but we're going to hire so-and-so to make the fiberglass components.
But I wonder if they're talking more about like quilting or like,
you
know, like there's so many materials in this world. And I think there are so many artists who work, my impulse is always to have the idea first and then find the material that fits the idea and like work that direction. And it's really nice to not feel inhibited by a lack of experience with a particular material. Like I think I have an artist locally named Sarah Houle, who has like done work in performance and mask making and candles and like mural work and like music, you know, and like just works in all of these different materials. And she's always like having the idea first, and then and then sometimes it comes hand in hand with this like, you know, super fascination with like like making large candles that are like particular characters that reoccur as motifs and throughout her practice. But it's nice not to feel too held back, because if there is something that you just know has to be done in a particular way, just find someone who can do it well, so that you can be confident when you propose it that it's possible. And that it will be of a quality that will be, something that sits well with you as you walk away from it.
And if you're identifying a material that's like, you know, what you think will be potentially suspect, or might, you know, draw some concern, one thing you can do is point to precedents of existing works that have been made by others. Just be very clear in crediting those as not your own artwork and as made by the artist or whomever has made them. And we've seen some applications the other way where it's like very curious, like, oh, this person didn't make this artwork, but it's in their proposal for some reason.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's a whole nother conversation.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't show other people's art as your own. It's not a good idea.
But if you need to point to a precedent, you know, to show that, hey, this can be made out of a quilt, or this could be made out of this, and here it's been done. Yeah, why not?
Thank you. Do you feel like there will be further opportunities for more Rec City projects?
Whoa, topical. This isn't one of my co-curators asking, is it? I should almost look. So Rec City is still a registered organization. We've done 4 projects to date. Our last project was in 2018. And we kind of had a thing where for a couple years, at least, it seemed like every 3 years we do a project. Are you looking to see if
No, I'm just seeing who's there. Sorry.
It's so funny. We have talked about doing something in future. There's some things internally that we sort of need to address. Like one of our co-curators passed away a couple years ago, and we needed to give that the time, like after Matt died, to just like really think through what that process would look like without him. And just to know that that would feel okay to do a project without him. So we're currently looking into some possibilities. If anyone has like a sweet space / high-rise building with high level of vacancy, or like, we're not just into pre-demos. I think people kind of think of us that way, but that's not the only area that Rec City wants to work in. Like, we're quite intrigued by spaces in transition, and spaces that come with an amount of freedom for the artist that like they might not get in other contexts. Yeah, those are really spaces that appeal to us. I mean, we've been doing this project in our yard for the last few years called the Hibernation Project that like, I mean, it's a testament to our community that so many folks have been willing to participate in it. And it's been in our yard, and it's been online at points during COVID, and it's been in the backseats of cars, and it's been on hills where we fly kites that artists made. And like, you know, it's covered a lot of different sort of conceptual and media terrain. So that's been filling a little bit of that Rec City need in me, that need for like chaos and like, and also like the self-initiated work that like allows you to sort of like break the trends that kind of you might accidentally build up in yourself as an artist. So yeah, it's a long-winded answer, but who knows?
Thank you. When making a budget, how much do you allot for artist fee? And then the next question is like the same thing. How do you calculate your fee after all of the other expenses?
Yeah, what we've heard is 10 to 15% of your overall budget should be an artist fee. If there's some really excellent argument for more, make that excellent argument. Like, something I think people should be aware of is that's 10 to 15% if you're like hiring a fabricator, and basically that's just your artist fee. But if you're fabricating anything, you should get paid for your fabrication out of your budget. If you're doing any additional work, like say you're making a bespoke website for a particular artwork, like we've been able to make the argument in the past that we should get paid for that kind of work. Yeah, just like any work that you're doing, you should be paid for. And so with Studio North, when we were working with Studio North, for example, like, you know, they have a studio fee, and then they do fabrication in-house, so they would be charging for that fabrication. Yeah, like those sorts of things. And I mean, that was something that we sort of learned through Studio North also. And
I mean, it sometimes depends. Often it's kind of sad to say, but if a budget gets really tight, we've had projects where we've had to like garnish our own fee pretty heavily, just to the point where we're at least breaking even and the piece is getting made. But then sometimes it goes the other way, where it doesn't cost as much as you would think. And, you know, it depends. But yeah, I feel like around that 10% mark for a fee is not unheard of. Yeah, and it's funny because you might be looking at some of these budgets and being like, that's a $300,000 project, like 10% of that is like a huge amount of money. But if you're working on a project like that, it'll probably be years of work and hundreds of meetings. And so if you start actually breaking that down into CARFAC, like, you are being underpaid. So don't be nervous about that. Like, yeah, that's usually a pretty comfortable place to sit, is that kind of 10 to 15% range.
Thank you. Sounds like a lot of admin time. Do you feel like admin work makes up for a significantly high percentage of the time? How does it compare to the time spent in a more creative mode? Also, do you ever miss the hands-on aspect of creating work when working with large-scale fabricators?
Oh man,
all of
yes.
this, yes. Yeah.
Can we just say yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of admin time. I think we try and spend some time on our computers like every day. And like some of that's just like answering emails and answering questions. And we're also pretty negligent with our emails, which I hate to admit.
Better.
We could be better. And like some people, if you have a proper studio, which public artists sometimes when they get to a level decide that that's the route to go. And part of that is so that they can have like a studio manager and they can have someone dealing with the admin so that they can spend more of their time in the areas where they feel are their kind of strongest capacities. So like maybe that is like, like working hands-on, developing a process, skill building, whatever, like reading, like I have no idea what that actually, anyway. So sometimes there are artists, like I think of like Jen Lewin, for example, who's an artist in the States, and she's got like a full studio, like at least several employees, and they do like quite technical heavy artworks, and they're all interactive. They're quite interesting works, but she's got to hustle because she's got to feed all those people, right? Like she's got to pay them, she's got to deal with workmen's compensation and like studio fees and renting buildings and getting all the materials and stuff. So there's a pro and con in this that I think a lot of artists, once you get to a certain point, you kind of have to go through this self-reckoning of like what you want to be involved in and what you don't, and also what you're willing to give up control of. And like I just feel like sometimes with communication stuff, like you're your own first line of defense. And maybe because we're a little bit I feel sometimes a little bit control freaky, like it's really hard to like give up some of that control to someone else, which is it's a necessary part of collaborating. So like you just have to like navigate that process as you go, and you do it because it's more valuable to navigate it and to go through it than it is to do it by yourself and fail miserably. So yeah, that's kind of a thing that a lot of artists, I'm sure a lot of artists who are out there listening, like have kind of had this debate of like, do I start a studio? Like, do I hire a studio assistant? I have this budget, like, do I pay someone to help me with it? Or do I do the whole thing myself and like pocket this money? And like, it's just it's always a debate. And I feel like the answer is different every time. And it kind of should be a little bit different every time. There's this other aspect of this, not to get too long-winded, which is like, sometimes it is nice to pay other people to do stuff because then you're putting money back into your community. And like with public art budgets, like what's not often understood is that like 90% of the overall budget is being spent locally on local businesses and local people. And that's regardless of if your artist is based in New York City or like, in the city where the work is going. And so, yeah, there's something about sort of spreading out that funding like across a place that's kind of useful or whatever. Sorry, that was long-winded. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Sorry, my partner just got home and I was like, all right. I think we are at the last question here. It says, for proposal purposes, how do you put together a budget that is realistic?
Yeah, so you can solicit quotes for free from fabricators or contractors at any stage. And so if you know what you're asking for and you need at least a ballpark or even a full estimate, that's something you can reach out and ask for, and they'll give you a ballpark of, hey, I'm looking to, bend these metal hoops and weld them into a frame. Can you give me a price that it might cost? And you're not beholden to necessarily go with them or anything. I mean, it's a relationship you want to maintain in good faith. You shouldn't always just like lean on someone for quotes over and over, but without ever hiring them. But you're free to just get quotes from people and, take as much of a educated guess as you can. And, the more detailed you can get with a budget, the more honest it'll be in the end.
The other thing is if you just want a budget template, we have some budget templates that we've made and that we've shared and that I'm sure we've cobbled together from other people's budget templates. It's not like a quote or anything. It's like just here are some headings, or these are things you should think about. Like, there should be a line for insurance. Like there should be a line for whatever, like security, if it's like a temporary event, there should be a line for this or this or this or this. And we're happy to just like email that to you. So like send us an email if that's something that you need right now to work on your budget. Cause it sounds like there's a lot of people working on budget stuff. You can just email us at incandescentcloud@gmail.com. And I'm sure you can find us like our contact on our website. Yeah, that's.
I was gonna say, if you wanted to send it to, I think you've been in contact with Tara for this entire artwork talk, but if you wanted to just send her like the link or something like that, then we can send that out to all of the participants that were here today. So it's up to you. But
here, I'm just going to send everyone. I really hope nobody abuses, please.
It's publicly available.
It's publicly available. incandescentcloud@gmail.com.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, I'll include that too. I think I'll send out like the recording of this video to everyone and we can put in the email and all that. So that's great. Thank you. I think that was the last question. Let me just double check the chat box. You've got lots of thank yous so far.
Look at all these sweet comments.
Yes. Everyone's so
look at all these lovely pals who like have listened to us blabber. That's real nice.
Yeah, that's great. Suzanne, did you want to wrap up the session? I'll see if she's, oh, there we go.
Sure. I'm here. Thank you so much to our presenters, Caitlin and Wayne. That was really fabulous, and I think will be very helpful for people. Wonderful images to look at, and it's just a delight to see the work you're doing around the world and making places better. Also, thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. It's always terrific to provide these opportunities to working artists. So thank you to you for attending. As Angeline mentioned, this has been recorded and it will be uploaded to the Allied Arts Council YouTube channel. So it'll be available to people in the future. We're going to take a bit of a break through the summer. And we'll be back on September 8th with Shauna Hayward on how to move from artist to entrepreneur. So thank you to everybody. Did I freeze there?
Nope.
I think you're good.
Awesome. Okay, my internet is about to go out again.
Right.
Yes,
We'll wrap
thank you
this
so
up
much.
Thank you. Have a good night. Everyone.
Thank you, Angeline, for your support.
No worries. And take care. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. See you.
Let's see.